All right. So, hello everyone. Welcome back. So this is our second of 3 series in a row focused on different safety culture concepts and practices. And this one is focused on something called safety learning forums. And the name for this is relatively newer, but it's been an evolving kind of set of practices and concepts that I've been a part of with some of the districts here in Vermont. I used some of this in my previous work when I was working on the mental health side of this whole connection. And then some of these ideas came recently out of some connections with people across the country because Vermont's a part of this multi-state collaborative on child safety. We're able to learn and get ideas from others. And so some of the ideas for the safety learning forums came from that. And I would say that this is maybe more in the category of an early PDSA as opposed to huddles for removals. I think the safety culture work group was comfortable saying, we're going to endorse this as an established practice. This is maybe earlier. And so anyone who tries it out, I'll love your feedback about it, and then we can refine it from there. So let me continue. So our agenda is, I'm going to do a super brief, briefer than last time, review of what safety science is in case there are folks who are newer to it. Then we're going to talk about an airplane for a minute or two, the 737 MAX. Then we're going to talk about what are safety learning forums. I'll throw the information at you pretty rapidly so that we can save more time for your discussions in breakout rooms, and then for more time to discuss any questions or concerns that come up out of breakout rooms afterwards. And after breakout rooms, we're also going to be able to hear, I'm really hoping, from some folks in Barrie on Team Aurora there, because they've been using this to, I think, good effect. So maybe we can hear from them about that. So that's the agenda. We are recording the training. You can type questions or comments into the chat. Cassie's going to monitor that for us. But you can also unmute and just jump into the conversation anytime. You guys know me, I'm pretty informal and I like dialogue. So please do that if you want. And Cassie, if there's something pertinent in the chat that I'm not seeing, just interrupt me, okay?
Moo.
Perfect. Okay, so safety science is the application of scientifically rigorous study to fields that require safety to determine, what procedures and practices increase safe outcomes and which ones may not, so that we can learn from it. It began after the meltdown at Chernobyl because there was not safe practices, nor was there a culture there that allowed for that meltdown to stop earlier than it could have. And it spread from the nuclear industry into other fields. We see it most frequently ourselves in the aviation industry. And then it's worked its way into the medical health field as well. And most recently now it's moving into child protection. And the idea is that certain industries really must have very high reliability in terms of the safety of their outcomes. And so those organizations should strive to be what's referred to as a high reliability organization. And the only way to become a high reliability organization is to study your practices and match those to safety outcomes and continue to improve so that that we, DCF will have reliable outcomes regardless of who the worker is, what team they're on, what district they're in, those kinds of things. And you may remember a couple of years ago, I'm sure you remember, it was a couple of years ago and so much has happened since then, but there was news of this new Boeing 737 MAX. There were 2 crashes. The first one was through an airlines out of the Philippines. And then the second was an airlines in Ethiopia. And there were emergency freezes on the use of that plane. And just yesterday, the FAA announced that they're clearing the 737 MAX for flight again. So once COVID is done and you're ready to travel again, my question for you is, will you feel safe getting on a 737 MAX. What do you need to know has been done in order to determine what the cause of those crashes were or causes? So here we have a couple of pilots for me to represent the pilots that tragically died, right? The pilots as well as all the passengers on those flights died. The initial response for something like an airplane crashing could very easily be to just look at the pilots and their skills and their decisions and what the black box recorded. And we could just determine that those particular pilots were at fault. However, when they've studied these crashes, do you remember hearing about MCAS? MCAS was the new software that was engineered into that new MAX plane to control the flaps under certain conditions. But it was engineered in, and then pilots weren't told that it was in there. So there was a lack of training specific to the MCAS system. The MCAS system relied on certain sensors, and there are 2 of those sensors on the plane. But they didn't build in a redundancy. So if one of those sensors failed and sent a faulty reading to the MCAS system, then it would overreact and it would cause the plane to nose down and eventually crash. And they didn't build in this redundancy of another sensor that could correct for it. And they didn't teach pilots about it. There was also a lot of financial drive for Boeing. You might remember hearing about Airbus, their competitor, had just recently put out a new airplane. And so Boeing was under pressure to move theirs forward quickly. There's also been an incredible expansion of the airline industry across the world. And these emerging markets like the Philippines and Ethiopia don't have the same kinds of regulation that exist in the more established markets. And so you've got these pilots who are moved very quickly through the training in these new emerging markets. You've got an airplane manufacturer that built a system. They didn't tell everyone that they would need to train the pilots for that because of their financial pressures. There have been shifts over the past couple of decades where the FAA used to exist outside of an organization like Boeing and monitor their practices. And slowly over time, monitoring oversight has become more internal. So the FAA has trusted Boeing to monitor their own engineering and information. So that was another factor that was identified. There's poor maintenance on these planes. And so one of the 2 sensors that could send a faulty reading to the MCAS system hadn't been replaced, even though it had been noticed to be damaged. And then there was a lack of what they call airmanship, which Boeing designs its planes with an assumption that the pilots have a lot of air experience and that they can, through their air experience, figure certain things out if the systems are operating differently. Whereas Airbus designs these planes to be almost entirely automated. But the problem is that in these emerging markets, because of the lack of regulation and lack of training, these pilots hadn't developed this sense of airmanship. And so you have all of these pressures coming onto these pilots as well as the passengers in these planes at this given time. And so I offer this as an example because similar patterns will play out in child protection, where you'll have a worker or a couple of workers who are in a certain situation with a certain set of pressures, expectations, training that's been offered, training that hasn't been offered, and they're in that situation to navigate it. And when things go well, we may credit them as heroes at times without acknowledging, well, how did the system help it to go well? And when things go poorly, we definitely have had a history in our field of finding too much fault at the level of the individual. And you may have heard about in other states about individual family service workers being criminally charged, or even in some really tragic cases, becoming suicidal because of the pressure that they experienced when something didn't go safely, didn't go according to plan. And it's a really a faulty way of analyzing in order to prevent the same mistakes from happening again. In other words, if you or I were to get on a 737 MAX this summer, when maybe we'll be allowed to fly again, the fact that the review was this rigorous and that there are going to be interventions into the system at all of these different levels is really necessary for us to feel reassured that the plane isn't going to crash again the next time we go there. And so safety learning forums are designed to be a process that encourages reflection without simplifying it to an individual worker. It encourages reflection in a way that is hopefully psychologically safe and oriented toward both that individual's experience as well as the systemic factors at play. Okay, so in safety culture, there are these different domains. We talked last time about huddles at the point of removal, which are primarily a let's pause and plan ahead for this event that's coming up. And safety learning forums are primarily a reflecting back practice. They're designed to do that with really a careful and effective communication that, like I said, is hopefully psychologically safe, which are also, so the emotional regulation and effective communication are domains of safety culture as well. And the whole intention of reflecting back on these practices is to learn what are we doing as a system and individuals that help our outcomes be safe? Where could we improve? How can we learn so that next time we're doing this, it goes better? And then there's this reiterative cycle of continuing to reflect back, learn, improve, and plan ahead again. So it all connects together. Safety learning forums. So here's anyone know the artist over there? You probably all know the artist because these are those posters that you put up in college, right? M.C. Escher, right? So this is his reflecting globe. So research in the field of safety science and safety culture has shown that this reflecting back, if it's done with an intention toward learning, as opposed to an intention toward finding fault. If it's done with an intention toward learning at a system level, it can really actually improve the reliability of our outcomes. So let me tell you a little bit more about it. So these are operating agreements that I have pulled together myself that I propose as a starting point. Any team could adapt these, you could add to these, but I think there are 3 here and 2 more on the next slide. I think these are pretty essential. So the first is that the whole purpose of a safety learning forum is about safety learning, right? That safety is really our target on this. I mean physical safety outcomes for children and families. I mean physically safe outcomes for staff. And I also mean psychologically safe outcomes for staff and children and families. The second is that this work is really, really complex. It is a system of different organizations, policies, pressures coming together. And so we won't oversimplify it. We won't find individuals to be heroes because that's too simplified. We can't count on heroes for safe outcomes. We need to make sure the system is working well. And also, we won't find individual fault. There may be individual responsibility that sits within a larger context of also systemic factors at play. So it doesn't totally remove individual responsibility, but the idea is to be able to talk about past practices in a way where that individual or those workers who were involved in the work aren't worried that they're going to be getting in trouble for those decisions. So it's really about learning. And the work is so complex, so nuanced. We have to acknowledge that we are highly skilled professionals doing incredibly complicated, incredibly important work. And so the only way we can really honor ourselves and each other is to acknowledge that we can never allow ourselves to stop learning about this work. We have to strive to continue learning. So we'll commit to that process. And then the last 2 is that we will listen with an ear toward finding things that we really appreciate about the work that's being shared by our colleagues. And we will deliberately reflect back on what we appreciate because the strengths of their work and of the system are important for us to identify and keep reinforcing because those are one part of the equation for safe outcomes. And then the second is that we will honor that the work is so complicated that none of us can really know for sure how we may have been thinking or feeling what decisions we may have made if we were in that other worker's shoes at that point in time. And so what we're going to honor is we can't know. It's too complicated. The best we can do is be curious from a not knowing stance. And the idea is that in the reflective process of the safety learning forum that I'll talk more about, that after a team has heard a worker talk about their experience of the work, then it's the rest of the team members' turn to offer their reflections back. That's the second part of the conversation. And in that, they're going to be identifying things that they heard that they appreciated, and they're going to be offering other ideas, perspectives, questions from a curious, not knowing stance. I'm curious, I wasn't there, I can't know, but I wonder if maybe was classism a factor in what was going on? And so the idea behind appreciations, as well as the curious, not knowing stance, is that it can open dialogue, hopefully in a way that feels psychologically safe to everyone involved. Later on, I'll put in the chat a PDF document that has this information in it, as well as the phases of the conversation, and a couple of other things so that you have a little set of tools that you can refer back to if you want to use this in the future. So let me pause on operating agreements and ask if you have any questions about any of these. Would you unmute yourself or type those into the chat? Questions or comments? I'll wait a couple minutes and then I'll continue on. Or these guys. Okay, then I will continue on.
I can jump in really quick.
Yeah, hey Harmony.
I was just thinking of context of the operating agreements. I tend to think of those debriefs that we have with regards to safety incidents that we may come across in our work. So, you know, if you have a complicated removal, or if you have to fill out a staff safety incident report and you have to debrief with Shannon after, this is where a lot of that operating agreements, I find, are happening a lot more often.
They are happening.
Because that curiosity occurs naturally. Not everyone in a debrief was there physically for a removal or for a safety incident. So that curiosity naturally occurs. So that's just the context that I'm utilizing for this section.
That's great. I think that's helpful, Harmony, because what you're reminding us of is that this is just one kind of model for how a reflecting back can happen. We do reflecting back in this work all the time, right? In supervision, people are having reflective conversations all the time, one-on-one. Anytime we have a 3Ws conversation, that's a reflecting back practice, right? Family safety planning meetings involve both planning forward and reflecting back processes. I mean, even coordinated service plan meetings involve reflecting back, right? What strengths, what challenges, what services are already in place, which allows us then to say, what do we need to do moving forward? And then, yeah, consults with central office often involve reflecting back. So if these operating agreements resonate for people, they can be used in any of those different discussions as a way of kind of setting the tone in the beginning. Thanks, Harmony. All right, I'll continue on. Okay, so the way a safety learning forum goes is in 3 phases of dialogue. So the first phase, I'll talk about all of them really briefly and then in more detail. So the first phase is that if you imagine a team either sitting in a room together post-COVID or on a Zoom together, there's a worker who knows ahead of time that they're going to present some of their work, and there's an identified facilitator. And the facilitation does involve a little bit of skill, so it's something I think that teams should practice at. Often it may be a supervisor. At first it might be a TC from the CWTP partnership that helps get it started. Then it might be a supervisor that takes it over. And then down the road, when a team is really familiar with it, it's totally appropriate for people to take turns facilitating. So the facilitator interviews the worker about their work, and that's about 1/3 of whatever time you've set aside for the whole conversation. And everyone else is quiet. They're just listening and they're taking notes for what they appreciate and what they're curious about. Then the next phase is the worker's turn to be quiet and listen. And the facilitator turns to everyone else and says, all right, let's get this started. Reflect back, appreciations. What did you hear that you appreciated, either at the individual or the system level? What do you think really helped this process be safe? And then do you have any areas where you're curious? And remember, humble, curious, not knowing. And they actually talk with each other. They're not talking with the worker. The worker's just listening to them have a dialogue together and reflect. And then the facilitator says, okay, we've got about a third of our time remaining. Let's open it up. And based on everything we've heard, they turn to the worker first and they say, do you have ideas? Are there key learning ideas that you heard that bubbled up that we should really focus on here? And then it becomes a full dialogue with the full group about key learning and what do we want to do, action steps moving forward. So in the first phase, the facilitator should kind of open and introduce a safety learning forum. Just remind everyone the goal here is about learning. It's about learning about safety. And let's review the operating agreements. Let's remind ourselves to be thinking at a system level and to be humble with our curiosity. Then they ask the worker to offer a brief description. Ideally, the worker would have had a little bit of time ahead of time to prep. And things that can be helpful are things like genograms, or if it's a longer period of time that's being discussed, then you may want to simplify a timeline, a written timeline of the case that you can share with everyone else so that you can be pretty succinct and brief in kind of offering the context, the background around the case. You don't want to spend too much time on that. And then the facilitator just asks the worker to just talk about what aspects of this work felt clear to you. Where did you feel really confident? Were there areas that felt uncertain to you, where you left with that kind of feeling in your gut, like, yeesh, I just don't know about this? And let's talk about both of those. And then if the worker doesn't go to the system level on their own, the facilitator will ask them. And so here we have a worker and some of the system factors that may either support safe outcomes or add stress include things like the dynamics of your unit team at that time. So facilitator might ask, so Pete, you've talked a little bit about this. Tell us more. Were there ways that we as a team were helpful, could have been helpful? Were there ways that we inhibited your work on this? Help us understand that. Dynamics of leadership, right? So this can be a tricky thing for a supervisor to ask about, right? Because it's pretty vulnerable, but were there things that I or other leaders here in the district did or should have done or could have done to help? Were we a source of stress at all? And we're going to want to work our way around the system that we work within. What about our policies? Are our policies confusing? Do they conflict? What about our timelines? That's going to often be a source of stress, I would think, the timelines piece. What about this family and this child? Are there unique factors within this family system, right? Maybe the child had undiagnosed autism and we didn't know about that. Were there biased systems of thinking at play? To what extent was classism present? To what extent was racism present? Either in our thinking or others' thinking. I'll pause. Hey, Lisa, I see you raised your hand. Go ahead.
I apologize. I missed the first few minutes, but I'm wondering, is this something that's specifically supposed to be for small teams, or is it something you could utilize or should utilize in a whole staff meeting?
That's an awesome question. It's designed as a framework to be flexible with either. I think it's more successful with smaller groups that either already have some degree of psychological safety established together. Team is secure base, I think, is the language in Vermont that we use a lot. Or where you're working to build that. This process can actually really help build that over time. And hopefully the folks from Team Aurora and Barry can speak to that a little bit. The more people you get involved, the more difficult it is to ensure that you have that psychological safety. And so I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes, Lisa, about 3 different ways it can be used for smaller practices and larger issues. So I'll come back to your question a little more, but primarily it's for a team level discussion.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, for sure. So then we're gonna want to look at the training that was offered to the worker, the skills that the worker had, and the resources available to the worker, right? If you have a brand new worker, they won't have developed the same level of skills. If you have a worker that's been on the job for 5 or 10 years, they will have more skills. As a system, we can't assume, like in the 737 MAX, Boeing assumed that pilots had this thing they call airmanship, which is like the equivalent of clinical wisdom and savvy that we develop in our work. Once you hit, I don't know what it is, 5, 10 years, you have this ability to navigate things that's really, really different. If we assume that all workers have that and our system is designed with that assumption, that's going to set up new workers for sure, right? So it's not a question of were you unskilled? It's a question of, given the complexity of the situation, did the system support you given the skill set that you have currently? Does that make sense? Then we're going to want to look at legal pressures, and we're going to want to look at our partnerships with other agencies that we work with. There certainly could be additional system dynamics that people might want to look at, but this is what came to mind for me. So in the resource packet that I offer, you have this visual here, and then you can determine, what were the sources of support for this worker? What were the sources of stress on this worker while they made their decision? So the individual worker is interviewed about the work experience as well as some of this. Everyone else is listening. And then in the second phase, that worker is asked to, okay, thank you so much. Now, if you could be quiet and listen and take notes, we're going to turn to everyone else. Everyone else, what did you hear that you appreciated? And we talk about appreciations first. And then what, if anything, are you curious about? And this is an opportunity for workers maybe to come back to this and say, well, we didn't actually talk about how our team is doing. I'm curious about that. Were there ways that we could have been more supportive to you? And that can move the conversation forward. But they're talking really with one another. So, and that avoids putting the worker on the hot seat. The worker doesn't have to answer for his or her decisions immediately. It's just others being curious with each other. Have you heard of reflecting teams from family therapy? If you have, that's what this model is based on. So it becomes this dialogue, and then the facilitator says, great, that's awesome. We only have 20 minutes left of our hour. Let's open the dialogue up. So then they turn back to the worker. Based on this reflection and your own reflection, let's start identifying key learning. And if possible, we want to identify key learning based on the system review that we did, not just the worker needs to, but as a system, we should really look at this policy. It's a little bit vague or a little bit confusing, or we really need to talk to our state's attorney about this partnership in these situations because it's becoming problematic. So we want to look at system issues. If possible, we want to look at the system influences that seem to be most potent and the system patterns that are most likely to repeat again in the future. And then we want to try to brainstorm what action steps could we take in order to mitigate or adjust some of those systems to turn more of the system issues into supports and reduce the stressors. And this idea of looking at a system level, finding the more potent influences and finding the influences that are most likely to repeat, this is based on something that's called the Safe Systems Improvement Tool, which is a very structured reflecting back process that Vermont FSD has adopted to use for the most significant cases that we deal with, which are the unfortunate cases where there's a child fatality. So this is a shortened version of that thinking that doesn't take quite as much time and rigor as the Safe Systems Improvement Tool does. So those are the 3 phases of dialogue. So, and then one of the most important pieces is that the team celebrates, that's my little dancing people at the bottom here, the team celebrates the primary worker right at the end before, thank you so much for sharing your work. And if possible, you hand them a certificate. And this is just a goofy certificate that I made. And when I first handed it out in Barre, when we first started doing some of this work, I thought people would appreciate it in the moment and it would go into a pile on their desk. And I was so pleased when I popped into people's offices months later to see these things hanging up on the wall, because I think it signifies something that people are proud of. Being able to talk about your work with your colleagues in an open and vulnerable way really builds that sense of security. So I literally included this in the packet so that you can hand it to the person when they're done, if that's something that seems meaningful to you. So let me pause and see what questions folks have before I continue, or comments. Anything bubbling up in the chat, Cassie, or should I keep going? Looking good so far. You're muted.
I was trying to do the space bar trick. I guess it didn't work. Nothing in the chat.
Okay, I'll keep going then. All right. Another way that this helps is through norming. So if each of these dots represent a family service worker, highly skilled professional on a unit team, and if each of these dots proximity to one another represent how similar they are in their practices, even though they don't see each other. Let's say, kitchen table safety planning for an investigations front end team. If most of the workers live with this amount of risk, but there's a couple of workers who are outliers in their practice, you're not going to know that unless you talk with one another on a regular basis about what you do and don't do. And if you talk with one another about it, you can learn and you can move to be in proximity with one another. This is a protection against professional dangerousness, right? If there is a situation where, a worker is practicing like this and something bad happens on their case, and upon review, what's determined is they were doing things that nobody else on their team was really doing, that opens that individual up potentially for more liability. But if you're talking about these practices and learning, oh, okay, in a domestically violent situation, you do this, or when you have concerns about unacknowledged sexual abuse that may still be going on in the family system, you operate this way. Now we are both improving our safety outcomes and protecting ourselves from potential liability as well. So Lisa, to your question. So this can be used in a number of different ways. And if you haven't been using it yet, I would suggest starting with number one. And that would be regularly scheduled by a team. So a unit team says, let's try this. Let's do it once a month. And let's choose an aspect of our practice that we're all interested in learning about. And once a month, we'll take turns and a worker will come and they'll share about that work, and we'll do this and we'll learn from it. And then the next month, it'll be someone else's turn. And because there's 8 of us on the team, we're going to do it for at least 8 months just on this one practice, and then reassess at that point in time. And this is something that the Team Aurora, a front end team in Barrie, chose to do with kitchen table safety plans. And I'll ask Lynn if she's on the call to talk a little more about that later, but this came out of her Leadership Academy for Supervisors for Change initiative. And they went through a process for quite a while to do this. And we can hear from them, was it easy? Was it hard? How did it help? The reason I would suggest with beginning with that is that it really establishes familiarity with the process, as well as that sense of safety between one another. It can also be used down the road. Let's say a district decided that they really wanted to understand placement disruptions with a kin or foster placement. So a district could say, we're not going to do this every month, but we are going to commit to have a safety learning forum every time we have an unexpected disruption, to try to figure out what happened there and is there anything we could have done to avoid that. So that would be, we're planning it specific to a certain incident, but it'll only actually be triggered if that incident should happen. And then the last would be a team or a district recognizes that they've had a significant incident. They didn't plan ahead that they wanted to have one of these following those incidents, but they decide they'd like to use one then. These number 2 and number 3 are going to feel much safer, psychologically safer to everyone involved if people already have familiarity with doing it like is shown in number 1. You can definitely jump in at number 2 or number 3 without having done number 1 a couple of times, but whoever's facilitating should be much more mindful of the need to really monitor and facilitate a psychologically safe tone throughout the conversation. And number 3 is something that I'm working on with one of our districts out there right now to do something that we hadn't targeted ahead of time. And so we can report back, those folks and I, about how that goes. In general, the more complex the issue, the longer the team will need in terms of a block of time. I would say you're probably going to need a minimum of 45 minutes, even for something as simple as number 1. And if it's much more complicated, I think 90 minutes to even 2 hours would probably end up being necessary for something that maybe has decision points over a long period of time in the life of a case, right? If you're looking at a case that's been open for 8 years or something like that, obviously you're just going to need more time. But in general, you decide the amount of time ahead of time based on the complexity, and then you divide that into 3 chunks. And the facilitator uses the first chunk to interview the worker, the second chunk for the reflecting team, and the third chunk for everyone to talk. And then I mentioned the SSIT is what Vermont's going to use for child fatality. So that's the highest level of rigor. So my intention at this point is to send you into breakout rooms. Let's see how much time we have. We have 40 minutes. So I'm thinking, no, sorry, 20 minutes. We're at 40 minutes. Thanks for shaking your head no, Cassie. We have 20 minutes left. So what if I sent you into breakout rooms with these questions here? What questions do you have? What concerns might you have? Are there practices that you can already think of that might be worth regularly reflecting back on? Are there other system factors that I didn't include? So maybe 10 minutes in breakout rooms for that, and then we'll come back and we'll hopefully hear from some folks on Team Aurora about their experiences and broaden the conversation. So I'll stop my share. And let me put those questions in the chat. Just give me 1 sec. Okay, let me find the chat. I should have had Cassie do this. I wasn't planning ahead. Okay. So there's the questions, and I will start breakout rooms. Oh, good. I see Lynn there. Hi, Lynn. All right. Breakout rooms. Okay, let's go with 5 to 6 people in a room. So if you're on the call, make sure you unmute yourself and turn your camera on for your breakout room. I'll see you guys in 10 minutes. Hello to Naisha and Christine. Oh, there goes Christine. Naisha, I'm not sure if you're able to, but we have breakout rooms going, so if you'd like to. Okay. Welcome back. Let me see if everyone's back yet or not quite. Looks like we're all back. Okay, your time ran out. Okay, so now you may have questions. We'll come to those in a second, but I want to invite Lynn to get us started, and anyone else from Team Aurora who wants to tell us, what have you guys been up to? What's been working? What hasn't? How did you implement them? You able to start that off for us, Lynn?
Yeah, well, I think this framework's fantastic. So again, I think whether you've been practicing doing appreciative inquiry is another word that we've used for this practice for 5 years, 10 years, 1 year, 1 month, having this structure, Pete, you make it seem so easy, and that's great. So I think what came out of our break room is really around building consensus, building safety, and really what works well, even in a changing team, is really the agreements and that culture, the safety culture, and the agreements about how we're presenting our work, and that using that network. So we continue to use this framework to review our safety plans. I think it's been a bit challenging through COVID. It's a lot nicer when you're in the room, to be honest, when you're all together. It's a little harder virtually, but because we've engaged this practice for quite some time, it's something that we're comfortable doing. And the nice part of it is that we've been doing this now, Pete, for what, 1.5 years, 2 years?
Mm-hmm.
And so I see where we need to go next, which I appreciate from you, which is that conversation about systems, more in depth around systems. But what I could say about the 2 years is, as team members have come on board, that natural culture and observing the more seasoned workers present their work, be vulnerable, have the questions and curiosities, we've been able to continue that naturally and organically. And then I think we learn something each and every time we do that. Whether we're doing it accurately or not, it doesn't really matter. We're just doing it, which in and of itself makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And Lynn, I don't recall, did you decide on your own, or was it in dialogue with your team, the focus on safety planning? Was that something that came from the whole team? This is what we want to focus?
So the safety planning, we decided, sorry, Patrick's going to lose his mind. We decided because there was a lot of need, or people felt like they weren't sure about whether their safety plans were any good or how long they should have them. There was a lot of anxiety and risk held on to that. And there was not a whole lot of training initially after the foundations, and people were left feeling like, how do you learn this practice? How do you learn to do this? And we didn't have any answer for that.
Okay.
And so
that's great. Yeah. So the team said, we'd like to bolster our practice in this area. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to stop this share and just open it up. Are there questions that came from the breakout rooms that you'd like to pose? And is there anyone else from Team Aurora who wants to speak to your experience of this?
Hi, Pete.
Hey, Danielle.
So something that has been working really well for Team Aurora is we often visit the team as a secure base, and we have really worked and built a lot of professional intimacy on our team where vulnerability is really celebrated. And I had the opportunity to be part of a breakout group where there was some conversation about the additional challenges of being remote and not having so many opportunities to have that informal hallway conversation where you can build those relationships and kind of identify, who are your people in it, right? And so I wanted to share a strategy that one of the family services workers brought to our team, which I feel like has really continued the cultivation of our professional intimacy. And that was a daily check-in for 15 minutes each day where there's no agenda, you don't have to necessarily talk about what your day is going to look like or what, a particular case or anything. It can really just be, hey, my 2-year-old was up so much last night, and opportunities to really build some of those relationships, to hopefully mimic some of those hallway conversations, or when you pop in the morning and just say, hey, good morning. And that has felt really special. And I think we've seen the benefit of helping, hopefully being onboarding some of our newer folks, but also maintaining that closeness and the relationship and feeling of psychological safety.
Yeah, that's helpful, Danielle. That's really smart. Thanks. Questions, comments from everyone?
Danielle, I love that idea. I think that's a great way to, really get your team to feel secure, is really just having those informal relationship building conversations. So I appreciate that.
And Meredith, you guys do that in Morrisville all the time when you're in person. I bet you guys are missing it remotely. Yeah, because you're such a small, tight-knit group. Yeah.
We are, but I'm gonna put that in practice.
Great. So I did put a PDF document into the chat. If you click on it, it'll download for you. It has the operating agreements, the phases of the conversation, the system image, as well as a certificate if you want to use that incredible image of that woman balancing on a slack line above a waterfall. Other questions or comments that folks have? It can feel a little daunting to get started on this. So I'm gonna come back around to Team Aurora at some point in the future and see if maybe they'll be willing to let me join one and video record it like this, and then talk about another level of vulnerable. And then maybe that could be posted on SharePoint as an example of what it actually looks like, so that other people, could look at that if you want. And then I also want to offer that I can help or partner with my TC team to make sure that they feel ready. So if you want to have a first facilitation or 2 or 3 by someone else, I think, Lynn, we did that, right? In the beginning,
Yeah.
You were able to just be a part of it and I facilitated it, and then you took over. And now I think your team, do you do it every time now, or do you take turns facilitating?
Oh, no, we take turns. I would say that as equally as difficult as it is for anyone to be vulnerable to put their work out, it's equally difficult and vulnerable to be the facilitator and struggle with the language bit and move the team, the facilitation. So it is a practice, and I would just really like to emphasize that it is a practice, not just the system or the work you're evaluating, but just the whole working within a team and everyone taking that turn to facilitate it and struggle with the language or the movement of that particular meeting. But it's really good learning. I mean, there's so many things that come out of it other than just the one thing you're evaluating. I'll say that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that I hear districts talk about a lot is like affidavit writing, right? The complexity of that. You could choose something like affidavit writing and reflect back on it, and people could bring examples, and they could bring an example of an affidavit they thought they nailed and one where they were like D-, right? I mean, you could bring examples of strong work as well as work where you're acknowledging like, this was really complicated, I'd like to learn more about this one. So be broad in your thinking of what you could apply this to. Let's see what else. We're almost out of time. I'm putting the information in the chat for a survey about this training. So if you'd like, you can do that now. And we'll send an email reminder the beginning of next week, so that if now is not the right time for you, you can do it then. But I always appreciate your reflections back on my work so I can improve it in the future.
Can I jump in there too, Pete?
Yeah, go for it.
So we track a bunch of things, of course, right, about training. One of the things that we've noticed lately is that our return rate on evaluations since we've gone virtual is pretty low. Understandably, you get pulled into the next Zoom, the next meeting, but I just want to give an extra plug. It helps us shape literally all of our work. So if you have time to do it, It's really appreciated.
And I'll stay on if other folks have other questions or comments, but otherwise I would say, let's call it a wrap. And yep, and we have to go to our next meetings like Jay, and happy weekend all. Bye. Thank you for joining.
Pete, I was just thinking, so we're trying to do case reads as well on our team.
Yes.
And I almost volunteered myself to do a case read on a risk assessment that I did for one of my supervisees, and I botched it. I did it terribly. I reported the results inaccurately to the family and then had to go back, and it was really bad. And so I thought it would be a really good learning. And then, you know, there was some other stuff going on, and I was like, oh, I just don't know that I can be vulnerable about this as well right now.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we were to apply this framework to it of how to do it, that maybe I would have felt a little more comfortable, or maybe I will pose it to the team, because I think there's a lot of good learning to come from it.
So kind of overlay the psychological safety of this on top of a discussion about a case read.
Yeah.
I think
So
that's
I'd be interested to see if we could figure that out, because
I'll team with
I really messed it out, but I understand where I went wrong, and it made sense, and I could see someone else doing it as well.
Getting right in there. And I think we'll be doing a lot more with the case reads too. So it's a really timely thing to raise up and think through.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Other questions from you guys? Or
Something that had come up in our group was around, what if you're trying to introduce this when there may be folks on your team that don't feel like they have team as a secure base, right? And like, what is the prep work that may need to happen to get the team ready to kind of do this kind of model or roll this out per se? And some suggestions that had come up is maybe that a supervisor and a worker could practice in supervision using this model, you know, the reflecting back and the various steps to prep people to get to that place. I think, you know, because I think as Lynn was talking, you know, it's a 2-year process to get that team to where they are today. And, you know, I think that they, you know, are admirable in where they are at today to be able to kind of roll something like that out. But when you think about 12 different districts, 12, you know, how many teams within those districts that are at different places, giving the timing of what's happening right now, just to be thinking about how could we safely bring this up with people, you know, just as like a
it's true. I mean, there's so many dynamics, you know, it can be dependent on the supervisor's comfort with facilitation, because it can be complicated at times. It can be, you know, that maybe there's 1 or 2 workers on the team who don't understand how certain patterns impact their teammates, and right. So I think there is an importance to having some kind of assessment of that level of security that's already in the team. And if it's not there, why? Because that'll guide how you might introduce it.
Yeah.
And Lynn definitely did that with her team.
Well, I was thinking that, not to add more work to your plate, Pete, but you know, that I think it's helpful when you do it in a, you know, the larger group to bring the concepts, right? Mm-hmm. And to do a little bit of that role modeling practicing first to kind of tee it up. And then maybe there's some individualized work to get people on board and ready. And I do think that the whole process totally fits in with team as a secure base. It's just kind of getting to that.
The first couple of runs, people are nervous about it, and usually, I think it makes sense to pick one of your more secure workers to be the first guinea pig who's going to be willing to be vulnerable. Right? There's a lot of kind of decisions in rolling it out that can be really helpful. Yeah.
Good work, Pete.
Oh, sorry. Bye. Thanks, Lisa or Jean. Do you guys have other questions about it that you'd want to ask now? No. Okay.
I just wanted to ask quick. I told Cassie that I was going to give her the notes from our breakout room. Do you want me to send them to both of you?
Yeah.
Or just Cassie?
You can send them both. That'd be great.
Okay.
Good to see. Yeah.
Thank you, Harmony.
See you guys later.
Lisa, I couldn't hear what you were saying. You were muted.
You're still muted.
I wish I
Doing
could.
I'm just doing the survey.
Oh, thank
That's
you.
why I'm
Oh, yeah, Lisa. Well, wait, Lisa, can we give you kudos? Holy Brattleboro turnout. Wow.
Yes, thank
Yeah,
you.
I think that I was just writing this in the box. The micro learnings are the way to go because I understand that there's a lot of topics that need a longer training period, but really all you have to do is light the fire for people. And then if it's something they're interested in, they're going to go to the Child Welfare Partnership to get the extra help.
Yeah, good.
So, I mean,
good.
people have time to do that hour. And I had a lot of people that came last week, but we have all kinds of fires going today.
I
So
believe it.
not as many. But
Yeah, I believe it. Well, thank you so much for your support, and reach out if you want more on this or something
Yeah.
like that in
Yeah.
district. Okay.
yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Yeah. Have a nice weekend.
You too.
Thanks. Cassie, thanks.
See you shortly.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Bye.